Rather, when metaphysics thinks about truth, it thinks about the truth in terms of its very nature, its very essence, its very substance. So, the question, what is metaphysics, is almost identical with the question, what is this truth? What is this absolute truth? What is this truth with a capital T? And throughout the history of Western metaphysics, there have been various suggestions of how we can think about this absolute truth. One possibility is being. So when we think truth, when we think the absolute, we think towards the dimension of being. A good way to have a first approximate understanding of what being is that it is something like world, and when metaphysics enters its modern phase, which it does with Descartes, then Kant, and Hegel, then the absolute becomes the absolute subject, so that for Hegel, who is the last Western metaphysical thinker of the absolute, worlds as subject and as object. And so the world, the truth, is the unity of the difference between subject and object, and the unity of their difference realizes itself in the relation between subject and object, and there are various possibilities in which this relation can be thought. Basically, there are different modes in which the object can be disclosed, and so the relation between subject and object, the various modes of knowing, are different modes of disclosing the object. In such a relational disclosure, what is being disclosed is not just the object, but also the subject itself. The subject exists in different modes. When Hegel says subject, he means not person, not this or that subject, and he doesn't mean all persons together, the totality of all persons, the sum of all persons. No, when Hegel says subject, he means subjectivity or subjecthood, and that is what the subject is in its very nature, in its very essence, in its very truth. The subject is not a being, the subject is a mode of being, and it brings itself forth into various modes of being. These modes, for Hegel, are called consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason. The subject is therefore its possibilities. The subject is its possible modes of being, of relating to the object. And so it is the object. The object is not this object or that object. Neither is what Hegel calls the object all objects put together. And here we see the difference between object and world. The world is not the sum of objects. We cannot get to world when we add various objects together as the sum total of all objects. So For Hegel, unlike for Wittgenstein, the world is not all that is the case, all that which is the case. Rather, the world is the unity of the difference between subject and object, and the object is also, just like the subject, objecthood. The nature of what it means to be an object, and this object can be disclosed in very many different ways. It can be disclosed in very many different modes. And so, when we ask who is the subject and what is the object, then the answer for Hegel is there are different modes of being into which the relations between them bring them forth. Now, the being of the absolute is its becoming. For Hegel, all being is a becoming. Something is what it becomes, and what it becomes is what it is. And so, the absolute is the unity of the difference between being and becoming. Since the being of the absolute is its becoming, we cannot say what the absolute is in a simple propositional statement. To say, for example, the absolute is X means to say that the absolute is not Y. And that cannot be, because the absolute is the unity and totality of all there is. And so one cannot say what the absolute is in a simple proposition, because if we were to do that, then we would have to say the absolute is X, and if it X, it is not Y, but that cannot be the absolute, because the absolute cannot have an exclusion to it. So, we cannot say what the absolute is, we cannot represent it. The absolute is not the object of a representation. It does become an object of representation in religion, and religion for Hegel is indeed one of the ways in which the absolute presents itself. It is one possibility. There are three possibilities for Hegel in which the absolute presents itself. One is philosophy, the second is religion, and the third is art. Philosophy, religion, and art are all ways in which the absolute presents itself. When Hegel says religion, he means Christianity. When Hegel says art, he means Greek art. And when Hegel says philosophy, he means the philosophy of absolute idealism. For Hegel, as a philosopher, the way in which to think the absolute cannot be to represent it as a god, as a religion does, and neither can philosophy represent the absolute in the form of a work of art, a physical thing. Philosophy can only think the absolute in its own terms, without thinking it, without representing it, as a god, for example. So the absolute in Hegel is not a god. The god is how the absolute appears to a religion. Likewise, the absolute is not art, because art is a thing, whereas for Hegel, the absolute is absolute reason. The being of the absolute is its becoming, and so the absolute is only as an absolving, as an absolution. And that means the absolute emerges gradually throughout the history of Western metaphysics. So for Hegel, the history of Western metaphysics is the history in and through which the absolute comes into its own. And so, in simple, trying to do it in a simple diagram, roughly, that is the history of Western metaphysics for Hegel. We start with the absolute subject. The absolute subject is the beginning. The being of the absolute subject, however, is its becoming. And this becoming involves, first, an unbecoming. The unbecoming is the separation, the rupture, the schism between subject and object. This schism, this rupture between subject and object is an unbecoming. This unbecoming is then overcome by a reconciliation between subject and object in such a way that the subject, as for itself, and the object as in itself, reconcile by realizing that both the for itself and the in itself are a self. Subject and object are both selves, and so Hegel's ontology is an ontology of the self. The being of the self is its becoming, which involves first its unbecoming, its split, its schism, its rupture. Then, that is, by the way, what Marx calls alienation. Alienation is when the subject occurs as object, when the subject occurs in a way that is alien to it. The subject occurs in a way that is not its own. The subject occurs as object. And that is what Hegel calls consciousness. Consciousness is that mode of the subject in which the subject is determined by the object. This is called materialism. The unbecoming is reconciled in an overcoming of alienation, and this overcoming of alienation is a homecoming. The absolute subject comes home to itself. And so, when we say, for Hegel, all being is a becoming, then we must think the becoming as an unbecoming, an overcoming, and a homecoming.
A primeira parte, como introdução, provocando pelas perguntas de ontem sobre a pós-verdade, ele decidiu de falar sobre o absoluto, a verdade absoluta, a verdade única. E o que ele faz, na verdade, é uma leitura a partir do esquema que ele apresentou ontem, que é o who, what e o how. E ele vai insistir no how, que é a relação entre o sujeito e o objeto, ele faz isso a partir de uma leitura mais ou menos heideggeriana da metafísica. E acho que com este esquema lá de truth, being, o mundo e o sujeito, você também tem um pouco a história da filosofia. No primeiro momento, a reflexão sobre o absoluto é uma reflexão ontológica. E depois, sabe, vai ter a história que vai entrar, e acho que vamos passar para a epistemologia, mas vamos ver, é só a minha interpretação e a minha expectativa. O que ele faz, este esquema da metafísica, ele vai elaborar a partir do Hegel. E o Hegel é sempre muito difícil, mas uma exposição realmente luminosa a partir de simplesmente essa ideia que o ser absoluto, na verdade, é não ser, mas é um devir. E ontem vocês vão talvez se lembrar que ele dizia que a unidade da diferença, isso é a dialética. E isso é uma frase que vem de Luhmann, mas que agora ele está reinterpretando numa perspectiva hegeliana. É mais ou menos isso que ele está fazendo, e ele está dizendo que em Hegel você sempre tem, digamos, essa ontologia do absoluto, que na verdade vai se apresentar como uma ontologia do self, porque você começa, digamos, com um self, digamos, originário, que é unitário, por exemplo, vai encontrar na filosofia grega, e depois aqui simplesmente, digamos, agora que me lembro da filosofia do espírito, no qual vai ter uma bifurcação, uma Entzweiung, uma alienação entre o sujeito e o objeto, e toda a história da filosofia, que é ao mesmo tempo também a história da humanidade, é como dizer, o tornar-se reflexivo do sujeito, que vai, na verdade, incorporar o objeto. Então, o self do início vai se encontrar, mas desta vez incorporando todo o percurso, digamos, da história. E é um pouco isso que ele estava tentando dizer de maneira bem didática. All right.
When we think the absolute, a temptation is to oppose the absolute to the relative. Those are opposites. If we think about the absolute in that way, we say that the absolute is not the relative. And that, for Hegel, is not a possibility, because then there would be something the absolute is not. And that cannot be. So, the absolute is not simply opposed to the relative, rather, the absolute is the unity of the difference between the absolute and the relative. And that means that the absolute, in its becoming, can come home to itself only through its unbecoming, and this unbecoming is the absolute in its various relative modes. The absolute has to go through its various relative modes, and it comes to itself only in going through its various relative modes. That is the Hegelian notion of experience, which is very different from the Kantian notion of experience. For Kant, experience is the totality and unity of science, which for Kant basically is classical mechanics, Newtonian physics. For Hegel, experience is the going through. In the going through, it's unbecoming as the relative, the absolute gradually accomplishes itself. It produces itself. In Hegel, we still have a metaphysical notion of production, which then in Marx takes a very different turn towards economic production, material production, bases, modes of production, and so on. In Hegel, the production means that the subject is a being that produces itself from itself and out of itself. The production is a bringing itself forth. The subject brings itself forth into various modes of its being, and the history of the subject is the surpassing of these various existential modes, so that we can say the subject is a self-relating relation, it is a self-producing production, the subject is its realization in the form of surpassing each of its relative modes. The subject is therefore a self-transcending, the subject is a self-surpassing, and this self-surpassing leads eventually to the return, to the homecoming, to the absolute subject again. Now, the absolute is not a being. We cannot find the absolute next to other beings. It is not that here we have the cup, here we have the bottle, and then we find the absolute somewhere next to it. In this sense, the absolute is very similar to the notion world. So, the cup is in the world, the bottle is in the world, but we cannot find world in the same way we can find the cup and the bottle. That means the world is not a being amongst other beings. And that is the difficulty in thinking about the absolute. The absolute is not a being, it is not even the highest being. It is not a God. Neither is the absolute, for Hegel, a region of being, somehow above or beyond the ordinary world. The absolute is not an afterlife. It is not the same as Christian eternity. Rather, the absolute can come to itself, can produce itself, can accomplish itself only through its unbecoming, and that means the absolute must enter the world. And then it must absolve itself from the world again in its homecoming.
Ele continuou, digamos, a sua interpretação de Hegel, e acho que ele faz isso de duas maneiras. De uma maneira a partir da sua teoria da observação, um esquema básico, e essa ideia que há da unidade entre a diferença. Então ele começou com uma oposição entre o absoluto e o relativo, e mostrou que em Hegel, na verdade, o absoluto só vai se realizar passando pelo relativo. E quando porque ele usa muitas vezes a palavra do mundo, o mundo, digamos, não está no mundo, mas é exatamente essa totalidade. Eu acho que lá ele está fazendo uma leitura a partir do Heidegger sobre a diferença ontológica. Então, o que temos, na verdade, é uma interpretação de Hegel, uma reconstrução a partir de, digamos, um pouco ideias de Luhmann e com também, digamos, o Heidegger. Isso não foi a resumo, foi a tentativa de acompanhá-lo digamos, na elaboração.
We are trying to come to grips with what it means to think the absolute, and we're trying to come to grips what it means to think the absolute with the last thinker of the West to try to think the absolute, Hegel. So far, we have the absolute is not a being next to other beings. Neither is the absolute the higher being or the highest being. The absolute is rather an absolving. The being of the absolute is its becoming. The becoming of the absolute involves its unbecoming, when it becomes other than itself, the object. This unbecoming then is overcome, and the overcoming leads to a homecoming. The absolute is the beginning. But it's not just the beginning. It is not the beginning in when we say the TV show begins at 6 o'clock, the seminar begins at 7 o'clock, or the modern West begins with the French Revolution. When we say beginning, then we must think it with Hegel, and that means in a speculative, dialectical way. Which beginning is the beginning? It is not any beginning, rather it is the beginning that begins itself. And that is the only beginning that Hegel has in mind when he says beginning. It is that beginning that begins with itself. It is a self-beginning beginning. And that is another way in which we can hint, and all I'm doing here is hint at the absolute, to give you a wink in what direction we have to think the absolute if we want to think it with Hegel. And one hint, one wink is the absolute is a self-beginning beginning, and that is the subject. The subject is that being that needs no other being to be who it is. The object needs another object. It is always related to another object. It is caused by another object. What the object does is not up to itself. The object is the object of forces outside of itself, outside of its control. The object is driven by causal forces. The subject, however, is a self, and the self is self-sufficient. A self is self-sufficient when it needs no other being to be who it is. And so, the subject, as the absolute, is a self-sufficiency. It produces itself, it accomplishes itself, out of itself, from itself. That is what it means to be a for itself for Hegel, as opposed to an in itself. The for itself exists for itself, that is, it relates itself to itself. It is a self-relating relation. And so, the formal way to represent this is in this way. The subject as a self-relating relation in its absolute form. It is with itself, by itself, and there's nothing alien, there is nothing outside of it. It is a self-sufficient subject. The absolute is the beginning. It is the beginning that begins with itself. It is the beginning that begins out of and from within itself. The beginning is related to the end. So we need to think the beginning and the end. Life and death. That is a metaphysical notion of death. the metaphysical notion of death is not the cessation of biological functions. That is the dominant understanding that we have today, which I call the medical-pharmaceutical paradigm of thinking about death. Death occurs when vital biological functions cease. Metaphysical death is not like this at all. Metaphysical death, we have to think in three ways. First, it is what Hegel calls a dismemberment. The dismemberment is the rupture, the schism between subject and object. When the subject is confronted with something that is not it itself, it is its other. The other is the other of the subject, and so the schism is a dismemberment that breaks up, fractures, fragments the unity. And so, the first element of the metaphysical notion of death is something that belongs together, something that longs to be together, is torn asunder, is torn apart. That is the first death. The second notion, or the second element of the metaphysical notion of death is that death occurs as an arrest of a becoming. When the subject seizes the history of its becoming, when it is, so to speak, stuck in a certain mode of its being, which it usually is. It is usually stuck in its mode of being, and that is its everyday mode of being, and that is common sense. Common sense and is an arrest of the subject's becoming. It does not move out of common sense any longer, and so the metaphysical death is an arrest, a freezing of the subject's becoming. It halts its self-surpassing, it halts its self-transcending, and at this point it dies. That is the second component of the metaphysical notion of death. And the final, the third notion of metaphysical death is that metaphysical death is a closing of the subject's possibilities. It is a closing of an horizon. It is an exhaustion of its possibilities. When something has exhausted its possibilities, when its horizon shrinks, when its horizon closes, then it has exhausted its possibilities and is now exhausted and dies. The great historian and philosopher Spengler calls this the winter of a culture, when it freezes, when it crystallizes, when it consolidates, when it cannot surpass itself any further, when it has exhausted its possibilities, then it enters its winter. So, the absolute is a beginning, but it is a beginning that begins with itself. It is a self-beginning. Beginning, the beginning and the end, and we have to think the end metaphysically. That means the end is the end of the beginning. The end is the end of its own beginning. Likewise, the beginning is the beginning of the end. The beginning is the beginning of its own end. And so, beginning and end are related through the unity of the difference, and that is dialectics.
Una reflexão profunda sobre o início e o fim, que era muito clara e que não vou repetir. E depois ele fez a conexão entre a vida e a morte e uma concepção, um conceito metafísico da morte, que tem a ver com o ser que vai se dividir, que vai se fragmentar, que depois, nessa fragmentação, vai também parar a interrupção do devir, de tornar-se uma fixação, e que a morte vai intervir quando exatamente você tem o fechamento, o encerramento das possibilidades, o horizonte que vai se fechar. E no final ele explicou, digamos, a interrelação do fim e do início, o início como o início do fim, o fim como o início, sabe, foi acho que ia nessa direção, para retomar essa ideia que ele já tinha formulado ontem, que a dialética é exatamente a tentativa de pensar a unidade da diferença. Isso é bastante importante, porque quando você começa com a diferença, você não está mais numa teoria da identidade, mas numa teoria da diferença, e sabe o que ele estava fazendo o tempo todo, uma releitura, digamos, a partir de alguns conceitos elementares de uma leitura luminosa de textos difíceis do Hegel sobre o início e o fim. Nós estamos ainda no meio, então vou repassar a palavra para ele.
We are now in a position to answer the question, who is Hegel? And the question, who is Hegel, is not a question of biography. We're not interested, of course, in the person of Hegel, in his biographical, accidental contingency. Rather, we're asking, who is Hegel in the context of metaphysics? And Hegel is the end of a beginning, and at the same time, the beginning of the end. He is the end of the beginning of Western metaphysics, and he's the beginning of the end of modernity. Modernity begins to end with Hegel, and the most important event during this period is the transition from the philosophy of Hegel, which is German idealism, absolute idealism, to the German ideology of Marx. So after Hegel, the absolute comes under suspicion. Marx is one of the great suspicious observers. In the history of Western metaphysics, in the history of Western thinking, there are four great suspicious observers. There is Marx, there is Nietzsche, there's Freud, and there's Darwin. Those are the four great suspicious observers. What are the suspicious observers suspicious of? They are suspicious of the very idea of the absolute. And so, for Marx, the absolute is an ideological fiction. Marx follows Feuerbach in the critique of Christianity, in saying that the absolute is in fact a rationalization, an idealization of the being of the human being. The absolute does not exist in and of itself, rather the absolute is simply the hypostization of the human being. The absolute is how the human being sees itself in an ideal form, and so the absolute itself does not exist. It is a fiction, and so Marx observes German idealism as an ideology. And that is the first attack against the absolute. And any attempt to think the absolute will have to reckon with that attack. The second attack against the absolute comes from Nietzsche. In his work, How the True World Became a Fable, The absolute is the true world for Nietzsche. Nietzsche says Christianity is Platonism for the people. What does that mean? Platonism is the notion that there is a world of everyday, ordinary, physical, material reality, and then there is a metaphysical world above this, which is the world of the idea. Of course, the Platonic notion of idea has nothing to do with what we now call idea. We now call idea something that persons have. I have an idea. Where is my idea? My idea is in my head, is in my mind. So we think of the idea in terms of a personal belief. Nothing could be further from the Platonic notion of idea. In Plato, the idea is the essence, the substance, the truth of what something is, and that idea occurs in a distorted, in an impoverished form than in what we call the real world, the material world, where we have not the idea of treehood, what tree is in truth, but rather we have this tree and that tree, and then another tree, and then we don't see treehood for all the many trees. So, for Nietzsche, Christianity is a particular expression of the will to power, and so, with Nietzsche, the absolute turns into values, and the values are what the will of power needs to stabilize itself. For Nietzsche, truth is not opposed to power. That is a major misunderstanding, that one incurs Nietzsche to speak truth to power. That is not an opposition in Nietzsche. Rather, in Nietzsche, truth is a particular way in which the will to power stabilizes itself, consolidates itself, arrests its becoming into a particular being, which being is then truth. And so, the attack that Nietzsche rides against the absolute is very similar to that by Marx. The absolute is a fiction. The truth is a fiction. The truth is that fiction. The truth is that illusion that the will to power needs to stabilize, to consolidate itself into a stable frame. What happens to the absolute then? It turns into values. And that is the origin of the value talk that we have today, which is a sign of nihilism, of course. And so for Nietzsche, the history of Western metaphysics is the history in which the absolute gradually disappears, evaporates, becomes a nihil, a nothing. So that only the relative is left. This is the metaphysical, and this is the physical. And so only the physical is left, whereas the absolute, the otherworldly, the true world evaporates and is gradually eliminated, so that we are left with the one-dimensional world in Marcuse's terms, a world in which two things happen. First, truth from now on, and now on means the end of the 19th century, yeah? What we're talking about here is a radical transformation that occurs in the transition from Hegel to Marx. Mm-hmm. This is not just the replacement of one person, of one intellectual by another. Mm-hmm. It is not just the replacement of idealism by materialism. They are, by the way, the same. Idealism is the same as materialism because they belong to each other, and so they are opposites of each other. Their opposition betrays an underlying unity. And so they are the same, not in the sense that they are identical, They are opposites, but they are opposites of each other, and so one cannot be without the other. One needs the other to be what it is. So the transition Hegel-Marx is not just a transition between one philosophy and another. Rather, what occurs here is the collapse of the metaphysical world. The world no longer whirls as a metaphysical world. The world becomes one-dimensional, and that has, again, two important consequences. One is that from now on, the truth is the truth of the sciences, the positive sciences, the empirical sciences. From now on, the empirical positive sciences have a privileged access to truth. Truth is now synonymous with the scientific truth, and that is one sign of the evaporation, of the erosion, of the collapse of metaphysics. There is no more metaphysics, there's only physics. And so, positivism and empiricism emerge. The idea of positivism, of empiricism, is that the entire notion of the metaphysical is an illusion, is a fiction. And so the rise of the sciences, in which the truth now becomes the exclusive property of the sciences, is accompanied by a drastic change in philosophy, which now becomes positivist, empiricist, so that our dominant ontology today is physicalism. So, the truth becomes the scientific truth, and reality now becomes empirical reality, physical reality, material reality. And that is the collapse of the metaphysical world, and that occurs in the transition from Hegel to Marx.
Ele começou com a pergunta quem é o Hegel, e claro, não é uma questão sobre a biografia, mas o Hegel é o início do fim da metafísica e também o fim da modernidade. Então, o que acontece nessa transição, digamos, depois do Hegel, vai ter, digamos, o absoluto que vai ser absorvido. Vai simplesmente desaparecer, a gente vai passar da metafísica para a física, essa dimensão especulativa que vai desaparecer, que ainda tem o idealismo e o materialismo. Ele vai dizer o que vai acontecer depois, sabe, na transição de Hegel para Marx e para o Nietzsche, é que vamos passar de uma ideia metafísica da verdade para uma ideia digamos, científica da verdade. E o mundo vai se desfazer e, sabe, as ideias vão se desfazer e no final vamos só ter um mundo físico. Ele utilizou a palavra grega o mestres do suspeito e já estamos no segundo. Tinha o Marx, tinha o Nietzsche e agora Raquel está esperando a chegada do Freud. E depois vamos ter o Darwin também.
One last sign of the collapse of the metaphysical world, besides the rise of the sciences and the turning of reality into material physical reality, is that philosophy becomes analytical philosophy, at least in the Anglo-Saxon nations. What is called continental philosophy is basically reinterpretations of the classics and synthesis of classical philosophies and minor changes in classical philosophies. In the Anglo-Saxon world, philosophy is analytical philosophy, and analytical philosophy is largely an appendix, a rationalization of the sciences. It's like a public front stage presentation of the sciences. That is what analytical philosophy is. It is a rationalization and justification of the sciences. And the latest sign of the collapse of the metaphysical world is when philosophy turns into experimental philosophy. That term, experimental philosophy, is really a contradiction in terms. It is a very wooden irony. Philosophy cannot be experimental. If we want to know what philosophy is, we cannot find out by means of an experiment. No experiment will ever show us what philosophy is. Even worse, no experiment could ever show what an experiment is, what the truth, what the essence of an experiment is. And so, the very notion of experimental philosophy is a very, very dubious one. Philosophy is not experimental, rather philosophy should tell us what an experiment is. And what an experiment is, you cannot find out by making an experiment. Now the last attack against the absolute, after Marx, after Nietzsche, is the sociology of religion, and in particular, in its Durkheimian version, the most fundamental distinction. The most fundamental distinction that the observer religion draws, according to Durkheim, is the distinction between the sacred and the profane. All religions draw this distinction, according to Durkheim. They differ in what they consider sacred and what they consider profane, so that some religions consider different things sacred and different things profane than others, but according to Durkheim, they all draw the distinction between the sacred and the profane. The sacred here is the absolute, of course, whereas the profane is the relative. So in a religion, the arrow, the relation between the two can only come from the top. It can only come from the absolute. The absolute is the ground, the source, the foundation of all that is. And so the relation between the sacred and the profane emanates from the sacred. What Durkheim does is he reverses this arrow and says, no, the sacred is a construct of society. When the society worships the sacred, it worships itself. And so what happens ultimately with Durkheim is also the eradication, the erosion of the sacred. Durkheim turns the sacred into an independent variable. And that is the end of the sacred. We shall see tomorrow, or maybe later today, that the sociology of religion can arrive at the sociological truth about religion. But the sociology of religion can never reveal or uncover the truth of the religion, the truth within which the religion exists. Sociology can establish the truth about religion, which truth remains its own. It remains sociology's truth. It remains the sociological truth. But it can never establish the truth of the religion. For that, we need a completely different observer, and that is the observer phenomenology. So, Durkheim's sociology of religion is the third way in the growing erosion, annihilation of the absolute, is the third wave in the collapse of the metaphysical world. And that, for Nietzsche, is the coming of nihilism. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, what we're up against when we are trying to think the absolute, when we are trying to think the truth with a capital T.
Eu estava esperando ouvir sobre Freud, mas aparentemente Durkheim também foi promovido a destruidor do absoluto. Então, basicamente, o que ele traz aqui do Durkheim é sobretudo a sociologia da religião e aquilo que constitui o núcleo da proposta de sociologia da religião do Durkheim, que é a separação estrutural entre sagrado e profano, em que originalmente você pensa o sagrado como aquilo que determina o profano, e Durkheim inverte essa equação. De que modo? Fazendo com que o sagrado seja uma emanação, seja uma produção da coletividade, portanto, da sociedade empiricamente dada, ela é uma criação. E isso em si mesmo, pensar o sagrado como uma criação social, é em si mesmo um ataque à noção de absoluto. E é nesse sentido que ele diz que a sociologia da religião, ela só pode trazer uma verdade sobre a religião, mas nunca a verdade da religião. Porque é sempre um olhar sociológico, portanto contingente, sobre o que é a religião, e não traz a verdade tal qual a religião representa a si mesma. E essa verdade, ou ao menos essa verdade mais próxima do que é a verdade da religião, só poderia ser trazida pela fenomenologia.
Então, o que vamos fazer um intervalo agora, se for possível.
Só tenho que providenciar rapidinho, então.
Because the coffee hasn't arrived yet.
Oh, it hasn't arrived yet.
But I guess no problem. Você acha que tem problema? Não, né?
Não.
A gente faz um intervalinho um pouquinho mais longo.
A gente faz um intervalo, e o que ele vai fazer depois, ele vai voltar para a teoria da observação, que vai ser, digamos, a versão sociológica do fim da metafísica. No momento ainda estamos no início do fim, e já, sabe, vamos depois do intervalo ver o fim do fim mesmo.
Só queria aproveitar então para dizer que nós temos aqui também uma banquinha com alguns livros e revistas, exemplares da revista Sociologia, se o pessoal quiser dar uma olhada. E como o café ainda está sendo preparado, nós temos um café ali na sala 208, a gente faz um intervalinho um pouquinho mais longo, são 3h30, a gente faz uns 20, 25 minutos de intervalo.